Okay, dear friends, welcome and thank you so much for attending this event. I'm Luis Alberto Pino, Head Programs and Content at the Chile Pacific Foundation. At the Foundation, we're proud of partnering with, for the first time, with the Faculty of Economy and Business Administration of the prestigious Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, the Foundation of Economy and Business Administration of the Pontifical Catholic University's alumni, and of course, the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council to carry out this digital seminar, which will dive into the prospects for trade against the backdrop of a strained and pretty much disrupted global landscape. We would like to especially recognize the enthusiastic support provided every step of the way by Catholic University's Professor Rodrigo Fuentes, an outstanding Chilean economist who is a close and long-time collaborator with the Foundation and Chile's representative at the State of the Region Reports Editorial Committee. The SOTR is the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council's flagship publication, an annual, highly insightful and influential report dedicated to the analysis of major economic trends across the Asia Pacific, which includes a large number of traditional and non-traditional realms of the economy. Established in 1980, the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, PECC, is the only non-government official observer of APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, in which Chile actively participates since 1994. And it aims to serve as a regional forum for cooperation and policy coordination to promote development in the Asia Pacific region. The Chile Pacific Foundation has headquartered the Chilean Committee of PECC over several decades. Today's event will center on Chapter 2 of the 2025-2026 edition of the State of the Region report, which explores how global trade is entering a phase of profound disruption shaped by structural and political shifts rather than temporary fluctuations. This section of the report highlights how protectionist trends reflect issues such as the uneven distribution of trade benefits and the increased securitization of economic policy. Additionally, it breaks down significant challenges facing trade, such as digital transformation, impacts on supply chains, and new industrial policies reshaping the trade landscape, among other key components that make the case for three policy imperatives, namely, preserving and reforming the multilateral system, ensuring regional and plurilateral agreements reinforce rather than fragment global rules, and harnessing the green transmission as a unifying focus for cooperation. This said, let me now introduce the distinguished members of the panel. I begin with Professor Sharon Zhengyan Sun, who co-authored the latest edition of the SOTR. She's the senior manager of research at the School of Public Policy of the University of Calgary and a distinguished fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Her research specialization focuses on international trade policy, China, and the Asia Pacific. Her broader interest focuses on free trade agreements in the Asia Pacific region and their impact on trade and infrastructure. Professor Ezequiel García Lembergman holds a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley, and is currently assistant professor at the Catholic University of Chile. His research focuses on international trade and environmental economics, with particular emphasis on non-tariff trade barriers, multinational firms, global value chains, and optimal carbon policies. He also works on international finance and firm dynamics. His research has been published in top-tier journals, as the Review of Economic and Statistics and the World Economy. He's also the co-editor of the Vox Debt Literature Review, on foreign direct investment and development. And Rodrigo Fuentes, who, as I said, is the actual host of this event, is a full professor at the Institute of Economics of the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. Previously, he worked as a senior economist in the research department of the Central Bank of Chile and was a professor and director of the Graduate School of Economics and Management at the University of Chile. He's been a consultant for the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. He holds a PhD and a Master of Arts in Economics from the University of California, Los Angeles, as well as a Master of Science in Finance and a degree in Business Administration from the University of Chile. Finally, let me tell you about the order of participation of this event. We'll go as follows. Professor Sharon Zhengyan Sun will present for about 20 minutes on the findings and conclusions of the SOTR as to international trade. She will be followed by Professor García, who will comment on Professor Zhengyan Sun's presentation for around 7 minutes. And then we'll engage in a question-answer based one-on-one interaction with her for another 7-8 minutes. And after that, we will have a 15-20 minutes section to take questions from the audience. And then Professor Fuentes will end the event by delivering some closing remarks. I invite you all to ask your questions at any time, either in the chat or through the question and answers button. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, or in the Q&A button at any time throughout the event. Having said this, Sharon, let me hand it over to you so you can begin your presentation. I will share the screen. Give me a second.
Thank you so much for the introduction.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction. Very nice to meet everyone. I had the pleasure of working with Sheila Armstrong from the Australian National University on one of the chapters here in the State of the Region Report 2025-2026. And I'll discuss some of the findings that we have. If you can go to the next slide. So before I begin, I just like to introduce the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, PECC. For those that are not very familiar, PECC is a leading non-governmental organization dedicated to enhancing economic cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region. PECC's mission is to actively support economic cooperation and sustainable growth for an open, stable Pacific community by leveraging tripartite collaboration and expertise to build evidence-based research insights, fostering inclusive, effective dialogue, and proactively providing forward-looking and actionable solutions. Next slide. And the State of the Region report, the SOTR report, is PECC's flagship publication. It is an annual report that aims to provide an assessment of the most pressing issues shaping the Asia-Pacific economy and the wider regional environment. Last year, the thematic focus was trade policy in a disrupted world, which I would say is still a topic that is highly relevant right now. Next slide. Just to quickly show you our methodology, we conducted large N survey from June to August of last year, and we had a total of 504 respondents from 24 economies. Also to emphasize that it's not a survey of public opinion, but it's a survey of expert opinions from the regional policy community that has knowledge on ongoing regional initiatives and activities, and whose views influence policy making, including leaders and experts from businesses, government, academia, media, and civil society. Next slide. This is just to show you that we had a very balanced number of submissions from across the Asia-Pacific region, as you can see here. So we were able to receive quite diverse perspectives on the risks confronting the region and the opportunities to enhance cooperation. Next slide. So last year, our survey showed that increased protectionism and trade wars emerged as the #1 risk to overall economic growth and as the most serious threat. Next slide. The share of respondents that considered the sentiment of increased protectionism and trade war as a risk to growth has risen sharply, as you can see here, is the highest last year in the last decade, where 88% of respondents cited that increased protectionism and trade war as one of the main threats to economic growth. According to IMF, the number of new trade restrictions have more than tripled since 2019. Next slide. So in my co-authorship with Shiro on this chapter of trade policies in a disrupted world, we relied on some of the survey findings to identify the drivers of the growing protectionism and the strain on the multilateral system. We examined how global trade is facing ongoing changes driven by political and structural shifts. We explored some of the new trade issues, such as economic security, supply chain vulnerability, digital fragmentation, and industrial policy, as Louis has mentioned, and what that could mean for the future of international trade, highlighting some priorities for policymakers in the region. Next slide. So the drivers of recent protectionism can be traced to a series of economic and political shocks, which provided the pretext for economies to turn inward. Firstly, there's the longer, kind of deeper structural problems. So firstly, the global center of economic gravity has shifted from the Western Atlantic to the Pacific. With the rise of large emerging economies, especially in Asia. And in the report, we compared the GDP PPP of the G7 with BRICS and the ASEAN +3 economies as a comparative example. And it just to signal that there is a shift now from a unipolar to a multipolar order. Simultaneously, we see that while there has been a shift in terms of economic gravity, the multilateral rules can no longer keep pace with the developments in so there's the failure to conclude the WTO Doha round that was launched in 2001 resulted in a proliferation of bilateral, regional, and plurilateral agreements to address issues that are now at the forefront of trade politics, such as digital trade and digital economy, data governance, climate measures, and environmental standards, just to name a few. The U.S. veto of the WTO appellate body is another example that resulted in the WTO unable to meaningfully conclude trade disputes between its members since 2019. There's also an uneven gain from trade domestically. So although trade liberalization generated prosperity and stability over the last few decades, the gains of trade were unevenly distributed, shaped in part by widening inequality and regional disparities, and many advanced economies struggle to provide effective support for displaced workers. Although other forces, such as technological disruption, played a critical role here. We've observed quite a bit of domestic backlash and erosion, particularly in the US, against free trade and international institutions. And so speaking of US, we also see a retreat of historic guarantor. So sentiment of this increasing protectionism is in part caused by the Trump administration's America First trade policy, which is seen by many economies as exhibiting a strong protectionist stance. Trump's America First policy has become one of the defining features of the current trade landscape. The initiative leverages tariffs to address U.S. merchandise trade imbalances, protect and stimulate its domestic industries, and to bring outsourced jobs home. In the end of August 2025, the U.S. average effective tariffs on the imports from the rest of the world was about 17.4%, which is the highest since 1935. So these trends are further exacerbated by short to medium term disruptions, such as the COVID-19 pandemic that we've seen, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as well as the US-Iran conflict today. And the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, exposed supply chain vulnerability and encouraged greater self-sufficiency in many economies. As we saw export restrictions imposed on medical supplies and personal protective equipment to prioritize domestic needs. It also exposed a degree of reliance on Asian manufacturing is one of the topics that we often hear in discussions. The Russia-Ukraine conflict and the US-Iran conflict today really impacts the energy market. And we've also seen impact on global fertilizer and food from the Russia-Ukraine conflict, for example, such as wheat, grain, natural gas. So it reshaped thinking around supply chain and economic interdependence. And many economies now emphasize national resilience and framing economic security as a sovereign issue to be managed through strengthening domestic capacity and self-reliance rather than global integration. Next slide. So this is the survey results that identified some of the top 5 factors driving concerns on trade and globalization last year. And as you can see, it is quite consistent with the kind of overarching general picture that I've provided so far. And so it also reflects factors such as job insecurity, national security concerns amid rising geopolitical tensions. Among the most important factors that are causing concerns on trade today. This is followed by the perception that one's economy is unable to move up in the global value chain and that foreign economies engage in unfair trade practices. Next slide. This slide here shows the growth expectations of one's economy divided by sub-regions. And what's interesting here is that last year, North American respondents are the most pessimistic about their own economic growth, with 85% respondents expecting growth to be much weaker or weaker in the next few years. And in terms of the Asia Pacific region, what we see is a much more divided view amongst Northeast Asian, as Southeast Asian, Oceania, for example, in terms of the expectation of their economic growth from issues such as increasing trade protectionism. What's interesting is we see here in the Pacific South America, the graph cut off Pacific South America, but what's interesting here is that Latin American economies see that there's actually more opportunities for growth compared to any of the other regions. Next slide. So our report further explores some of these new issues in global trade. Specifically, we looked at the return of security in economies, supply chain resilience, digital fragmentation, digital economy, and we mentioned AI in the report, as well as the use of industrial policy. So on return of security in economies, next slide. We increasingly see that trade policy can no longer be treated as separate from national security. Economic tools such as tariff, sanctions, export control, investment restriction, financial restriction, cyber-related measures are increasingly used for strategic or political purposes. And so this has blurred the lines between economic policy and national security policy. Economic security now means resilience, strategic autonomy, and the ability to withstand external shocks or coercion. But the danger here is that economic security can easily become justification for protectionism. Today, it may be important to maintain a strong national security stance, but the policy challenge here is that if every issue is securitized, trade becomes zero-sum and the rules-based system further weakens. The smaller to middle income APEC economies in particular are especially vulnerable when great powers use economic tools for strategic and political purposes. Governments feel that they may need to sacrifice economic openness to gain security. But this is dangerous because closed market, retaliation, or one-off bilateral deals do not actually guarantee security. And we've seen that increasingly from the one-off bilateral deals that some of the economies have been making with the US, for example. So the key point is that economies should try to become both more secure and more prosperous rather than treating security and openness as opposites. It's important to distinguish genuine resilience from protectionism, and we can do this by asking whether a policy reduces an identified vulnerability while preserving openness and efficiency, or whether it simply shields domestic industries from competition under the language of national security. The second issue that we discussed has been supply chain resilience. So as I've mentioned, the short to medium term shocks such as COVID-19 brought increased attention to supply chain uncertainty and concerns of over-reliance on any particular economy. Governments and firms became more interested in just-in-time strategies such as larger inventories, stockpiling, supplier diversification, reshoring, and friendshoring. Supply chain resilience is now often framed as reducing dependency on foreign suppliers. But domestic production, we argue in the report, does not automatically guarantee security because local production often still depends on imported inputs. And so we argue that supply chain resilience does not necessarily mean reshoring or self-sufficiency. Open markets and diversified suppliers are still better sources of resilience than trying to produce everything domestically. Next slide. So we discussed digital fragmentation in our report, we mentioned the disruption of AI, facilitating the adoption of emerging technology and artificial intelligence, and managing risks arising from these technologies is within the top 10 issues that respondents believe APEC leaders should prioritize as an issue to global trade. Digital trade and are major areas where global rules are underdeveloped. And at the same time, the digital economy is now central to growth and productivity and depends on cross-border data, software, digital services, and talent. And data and software create network effects. So restrictions on data flow, localization, and promoting national champions can reduce innovation and productivity and create what we call digital fragmentation or digital spaghetti bowl or noodle bowl effect. And digital fragmentation can be quite costly for businesses. The WTO and OECD recently examined the economic impact and found that in a worst case scenario of full digital fragmentation, where each economy shuts off data flow across borders, global GDP could be 4.5% lower and global export 8.5% lower than if data flowed freely. That being said, at the same time, digital sovereignty and data protection is also an important issue, particularly for smaller and medium-sized economy. So we see a challenging balance here between digital sovereignty and data protection, but at the same time, while trying to promote innovation and productivity by preventing and avoiding digital fragmentation, and smaller economy risk being excluded from frontier AI, and at the same time, fear of becoming too dependent on larger US or Chinese technological firms. And the AI aspects add a new level of risk, including cybersecurity, misinformation, deepfake, cyber theft, infrastructure vulnerability, and high energy demand. And actually, just to mention here that our SOTR report this year for 2026-2027 dives deeper into this AI discussion that our 2025 report does not. And so stay tuned for our SOTR report next year. Finally, we discuss the idea of new industrial policy. And here, new industrial policy is not really referring to the fact that economies have never used industrial policy in the past. That's not the case. What we are talking about here is that the increased protectionism and geopolitical competition have led to a renewed prominence and justification of industrial policy. So governments are increasingly using subsidies, tax credits, domestic content rules, public investment, not only to support growth, but also to respond to geopolitical rivalry, supply chain vulnerability, and competition over critical technologies. And we see this especially for green technology, semiconductor, battery, critical mineral, critical sectors, just to name a few. The U.S. Inflation Reductions Act, IRA, of 2022 is a really good example here in terms of committing roughly $369 billion to clean energy EVs and related manufacturing. So the key point here in the report is not necessarily rejecting industrial policy, but that poorly coordinated industrial policy can become protectionist. And subsidy races are risky because richer economies can spend far more than smaller or developing economies. And this can distort competition, weaken the level playing field, and fragment the trading system. Next slide. So on policy responses to some of these challenges, here I will first show some of the survey respondents' policy responses before providing our own recommendations from the report. When thinking about economic securitization such as tariffs, our survey results show the importance of strengthening regional trade, enhance Asia-Pacific and economic cooperation as a key strategy for lessening the adverse effects of trade, followed by diversification and negotiating with economies imposing tariffs. So about 85% of survey participants believe their government will enhance Asia-Pacific economic cooperation and integration as a way to respond to tariff. About 81.7% believe that their government will diversify to mitigate the tariff risks, and 80.7% believe that their government will negotiate bilaterally with economies that are imposing tariffs. Next slide. In terms of the usefulness of these government responses, 97.3% of our respondents considered strengthening regional trade to be an effective and useful policy. Interestingly here, just to point out, 61% of the respondents believe government should focus on domestic demand and domestic capabilities as a useful and effective policy, more than increasing support for multilateral institutions such as WTO, which is only 50% compared to the domestic demands of 61%. And the least number of respondents believe retaliation is an effective policy here. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. And just to show what this is, to break down into regions here, I thought it was particularly interesting to see that when you break it down to sub-regions on these policy responses and expectations, that North American respondents are the only ones out of all the regions that expects their government to likely retaliate compared to any other regions. So the first bar graph that you see here for retaliation, North America shows very likely expectation of their government to respond to tariffs with retaliation, compared to the Southeast Asia here on the right, which shows a lot more very unlikely and unlikely response to tariffs. Next slide. So that was the policy responses to some of the new challenges in global trade based on our survey. Here are some strategies we have recommended in our report. On the return of security in economies for middle and smaller APEC economies, the best response to the securitization of trade, such as economic coercion, is not retreat, retaliation, or choosing sides. Their real leverage comes from preserving the rules-based system, updating it through open plurilateral and regional cooperation, and using APEC style collective action to keep markets open and constrain great power excesses. A system of enforceable rules and open contestable market makes coercion harder and less effective. Preserving multilateral system and collective action prevents a shift to power-based bargaining and gives smaller economies influence by acting together. But one of the main challenges here is that real reform is required at the multilateral level. One way to reform incrementally that we've recommended is through plurilateral, regional, and pathfinder arrangements, and then build on the existing system rather than replacing it. We've also seen some successes on the multilateral reform. the WTO dispute settlement crisis that I've mentioned earlier regarding the appellate body is one example. So after the WTO appellate body became unable to function, Canada and the EU helped create the multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement, MPIA, as a temporary workaround. Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, China, Japan, and later Malaysia have since joined the MPIA as a way to function in the paralysis of the WTO appellate body. When we think about supply chain resilience, the best supply chain resilience is not actually retreating from global trade. As I mentioned earlier, self-reliance can be costly and inefficient and may simply concentrate the risk of imported inputs elsewhere. So open markets still gives firms more alternative buyers and suppliers. And in this framework, the rules-based trading system itself is a form of supply chain insurance because it gives firms more alternative buyers and suppliers. But of course, in our discussion, there is still the challenge of reliance and security question, especially when we go down to the product level analysis, which our report does not address, but this is one area that I look at in my own research. When we look at product level trade data, you have really significant large suppliers that dominate in certain agricultural sectors, for example. And so finding these alternative buyers and suppliers can be quite challenging. And what we are increasingly seeing is just adding levels in this supply chain. So adding complexity and levels in the supply chain rather than really finding true alternatives. Digital and AI governance needs multilateral or interoperative rules. Otherwise, digital protectionism could fragment market, reduce innovation, and deepen inequality. Finally, industrial policy may be unavoidable in the current environment, but it needs to be managed through clear rules, more transparency, and better coordination with partners, especially around green and technology subsidies, so it does not become a subsidy race or deepen trade fragmentation. Last slide. So the Asia Pacific has both the most to lose from trade disruption and the most institutional tools to respond. So we've identified 3 priorities for the region to consider based on all our strategies and based on the survey results that we found. So priority 1 is to preserve and reform the rules-based multilateral system. The fundamental logic of productivity gains from trade and multilateral cooperation still holds. The challenge is to rebuild trust in open and predictable rules-based trade while adapting institutions to the new realities. The second priority is to make sure regional and plurilateral agreements complement rather than replace the multilateral rules. CPTPP, RCEP, and APEC can be platforms for open regionalism, practical cooperation, and rule building. These regional agreements, such as TPP and RCEP, should encourage accession by any economies that are willing to meet the rules of the agreement, and plurilateral deals should ideally be designed in a way that they can be brought into the WTO framework when ready. And finally, for priority 3 is to have underlying principles and shared goals as a unifier for cooperation and coordinate domestically. In the report, we used better coordination on climate-related trade policies as one example of shared goals for cooperation. Here, it's important to balance domestic constituencies with how to make credible commitments to our trading partners at the same time. So ultimately, the main message here is the question is not whether economies should care about security and resilience. They should. The question is whether they pursue those goals by weakening the system that made them secure and prosperous in the first place. For Asia Pacific economies, the best responses to disruption is not retreat or reshore, but coordinated openness, institutional reform, and rule-based resilience. Next slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Sharon, for this very comprehensive presentation. I know it's not easy to kind of wrap up the whole report in just a few slides, but I mean, you've done a great job. Thank you so much. I took well note of many aspects, many points. I would point out the strategies that for middle-sized economies that you pointed out in one of your slides, and of course the priorities for the Asia Pacific region. I'm sure we'll be able to come back to those issues later on the event. And now I will hand it over to Professor Garcia for his comments on your presentation, and then the one-on-one interaction between both of you. Ezequiel, where you want.
Okay, 1 second. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this chapter. I really enjoy reading it. Really enjoy reading it. It goes to a very important topic that countries should discuss at this moment. So the first thing that strikes is that when you see the responses, you see that 70% of the respondents cite trade protection as a top concern for the next following years. And there are good reasons for that. If you see the share of world imports affected by some trade barrier, you will see that even since 2009, they start increasing, mostly with non-tariff measures, because the WTO was strong there. There were no increases in tariffs, but countries started using more non-tariff barriers. Then you have here the first US escalation of tariffs, and then now in the last year, you have a second escalation that basically doubled the share of world imports that are somehow affected by a trade barrier. And it seems that there's nothing to make us think that in the next following years, this trend will revert. And kind of the key question is what to expect and how countries can navigate these changes. So this chapter comes as a timely contribution, brings together expert views on the most pressing issues in trade and on expectations of government action, and moves also the conversation toward thinking in this and to try to think in which policies are the best for the next following year. So following the chapter and the discussion of Sharon, I wanted to press a little bit more in three topics that I found interesting, and I think it would be nice for Sharon to expand a little bit. One, it's supply chain resilience. The second one is what is the role of the World Trade Organization for the next years. And the third one is this idea that appears in the chapter and the presentation, which is green policy as a driver of cooperation, but it could also mask some kind of new trade protection. So in terms of the first one, so I will organize the discussion. I will explain a little bit my point, pose the question, and then at the end I will ask the question again to Sharon, and we go on kind of one-on-one discussion. So the first thing that comes out from the survey is when you see what people say, 75% think that the government is going to concentrate more in domestic markets, and 80% says that there will be more diversification. It's kind of, these two things might be a little bit opposite in some dimensions. And I mean, there are some reasons for people that think that local is safer, like recent Russia versus Europe gas situation, the COVID and the semiconductors, because there are some inputs that are very important and only some countries produce them. And so there might be a risk of being open to trade. But we know for a lot of research and evidence that for most of the goods, actually resilience comes from being able to trade with more markets, being able to buy inputs from more markets. So I think that the chapter makes a good point in like saying that isolation may reduce diversification and increase risk. And at the same time, if you're a small economy, like focusing on domestic market might be not enough, right? Like that's like one special issue for small economies. So here I will try to ask Sharon at the end if see after looking at the surveys, she thinks that governments are going to go more into isolation or go more into diversification, and at the same time how small economies respond to this type of challenge. The second one is that the chapter has a kind of positive view about the WTO and the possibility of still relying and reforming the World Trade Organization. People, the experts also say that in response to tariffs, like 50% respond that they will try to expect support from the WTO, from the World Trade Organization. But I mean, this of course might be the first best world that we have been living there a lot of time. But in this new world in which the major economies are like kind of not relying that much in the World Trade Organization rules, it's very likely that we are going to live in a second best world in which the World Trade Organization might not have the same power as before. So I wanted to ask, like, to press a little bit more in this second best world. Like, should we deepen more the regional trade agreements as a complement? What are the advantages and what are also the disadvantages of kind of relying in like cooperation between only like some parts of the world? And then the third point that I wanted to raise is that the chapter at the end, like kind of discuss green policy as a driver of cooperation. And I kind of think if it is cooperation, it might even be like not cooperation at all. Kind of the idea to think in policy regarding the environment as cooperation is that climate change is a shared problem, so it has shared gains, and this is how the chapter frames it. But at the same time, climate change is a public good and has the classic free rider problem, like when you impose an environmental policy, production might relocate to countries with weaker environmental regulations. So there's kind of a tension between countries in which one is the one imposing environmental regulation. There are also new policies coming up here in terms of the environment. You have European Union already implementing carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which are basically tariffs on carbon content of imports, which basically help to reduce production to move to countries outside the European Union. And there's a lot of discussion about these kind of climate clubs in which groups of countries coordinate climate policy. So we have the same climate policy, and whoever is not in the club has higher tariffs. So can we penalize with trade protection other countries? So I'm wondering is that one concern here is that these instruments, if you look at them, they might also look as trade protection. If you forget about the environment, you might be able to use these instruments as masking some kind of trade protection. So one question that I have here for Sharon is what would prevent, or how we would prevent, like this green policy from becoming like different kind of new trade barriers in the world, kind of similar to what happened to other non-tariff measures in the era of the World Trade Organization. So with that, I will kind of summarize my three questions for Sharon here, and maybe we can go back and forth, and Sharon might extend on these three topics that I summarize there. So
Sure.
Sharon, so maybe.
Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, yeah. So on question one, should we expect greater openness or increasing isolation? How should small economies navigate a more isolated world for supply chain? And whether or not governments are coming around to see openness as a source of resilience, or if I expect more isolation. I think on the first part of the question, we definitely see varied views across economies depending on the economy. For Canada, for example, international trade is a significant part of our economy, accounting for about 65% of the country's total GDP. And so isolation is a non-starter for a medium-sized economy like Canada. And so we have to look towards openness, and we have to look towards working with other economies to mitigate the risks and the trade war and the power dynamic between the great powers. So I think depending on the economy, I would say some certain aspects of trade is still very much openness is still extremely important for an economy like Canada, but there are areas where the economy is increasingly identifying as national security and requires more self-sufficiency in these areas. So on the openness front, one of the areas that Canada has identified is actually over-reliance on the US economy. And one of the things that the Canadian government has identified that is aside from the idea of diversification, because it's easy to say, well, if we're over-reliant on one economy, we will just diversify. But of course, it's not that easy to diversify, especially when you have at the provincial and state level, when you have integration in infrastructure, in supply chain, to just simply diversify. And so one of the areas of focus for the Canadian economy has been to improve domestic infrastructure in order to get goods to newer markets, whether that is natural gas, in terms of increasing the capacity of ports, as well as building new ports to facilitate this trade. And so that's one way to kind of navigate this increasingly isolated world, which is to kind of improve domestic capacity in order to actually facilitate diversification for greater openness. And at the same time, there are areas in which Canada has identified that it requires identified as national security, and so that includes critical minerals and electric vehicles, for example. But here I would caution that, again, which kind of actually addresses also your last question on to what extent to do these national security goals, to what extent to do these become actual protectionist measures rather than facilitate growth. And so in this instance, I think the Canadian EV market is a perfect example here, where there's actually benefits for the Canadian market and economy to open up EV trade rather than restricting EV and imposing local content and so on. So it's a very complex. These are big questions that are difficult to answer, but I would say that for smaller economies, isolation is just not an option. And so to facilitate greater openness, coordination and cooperation is very much required. And as I mentioned in the strategies, there's an urgent need to update the WTO rulebook to reflect and address these areas, because for smaller economies, acting collectively is one of the more powerful ways to in the face of this kind of great power competition and pressure from major power to avoid picking sides. On the second question on the WTO, what to recommend in a second best world? Should countries move to deepen regional trade agreement as a complement? What are the advantages and disadvantages? So I think given as I mentioned, there's still the WTO, there's a lot to be done at the WTO at the multilateral level that is beneficial to smaller to middle-sized Asia Pacific economies. But while we are still working towards reforming the multilateral system, the regional and plurilateral agreements play an essential role here, and that's why this is our second priority that we've suggested for the Asia Pacific region to consider, because we've seen this proliferation of regional trade agreements and plurilateral agreements because of the kind of slow consensus at the WTO at the multilateral level. And so we've seen quite effective regional and plurilateral agreements in place to kind of facilitate and what the WTO is not able to address. But what we wanted to emphasize in the report is that these deepening regional trade agreements should act as a complement rather than a competition towards the multilateral system. It should complement the global system. In terms of advantages and disadvantages here, the disadvantage is what we've seen from the proliferation of FTAs and RTAs, is that we are seeing an increasing spaghetti bowl effect of competition and overlapping of trade agreements, especially when we look at bilateral trade agreements and free trade agreements. And so this is why in the report, we really pushed and promoted plurilateral agreements such as the TPP and RCEP as some of the ways to kind of move forward. APEC is also a very important platform here for small and medium-sized economies in terms of voicing concerns and issues and addressing some of these issues that the multilateral system is unable to. And finally,
a follow-up that is related to this question too, but came up when seeing your presentation. Like when you see the surveys that you did, there's like many countries respond that they will, like, in response to these two tariffs, they will negotiate with economies imposing the tariffs, and then they also respond that they don't expect retaliation, right? But
Yeah.
I was thinking, like, of course, retaliation. If you go to a trade war, that would be for sure bad. But if you negotiate with economies imposing the tariff, but you know that you are not going to do retaliation, I wonder about the bargaining power of the economies when they are negotiating with the economies that impose the tariff, right? Because what's their bargaining power? That's kind of one potential issue that I can see there.
Yes, exactly. So that this is the reason why we recommended, sorry, my computer just froze. This is one of the reasons why we recommended collective action and system reform through APEC, through these plurilateral platforms. There is more pressure to the greater powers when it comes to negotiation, and there's also an interest by these powers. So under TPP or under RCEP, for RCEP, for example, where China is a member of the agreement, there is interest for China to uphold the rules in which it has signed and agreed. And so from the small economy perspective, there is more leverage in this area. And what I thought was really interesting when it came to the retaliation aspect that you mentioned, and how out of all the respondents, the North American region is one of the regions that are most likely to retaliate or support retaliation versus any other region. And I think the Canadian example here again is great because Canada, for example, retaliated to some of the US tariffs that were imposed against Canada. But this retaliation from the economic standpoint is actually very hurtful for the Canadian economy because you are essentially punishing your domestic consumers in these retaliation tariffs and not actually the US. But these retaliation efforts were put in place because of political pressure, because of domestic constituents, in terms of, the fact that we have to stand up against a great power. And so while, there is rationale as to why an economy would retaliate, it's clearly not the best option. And even through retaliation, it doesn't actually give you significant bargaining power with the great power. But of course, maybe at the sectoral and product level, there are areas in which US is highly dependent on Canada where retaliation could have some bargaining. But again, at the aggregate level, retaliation is not the most efficient and effective way, and rather openness and diversification, increasing domestic capacity in order to facilitate openness are better ways to for supply chain resiliency and to mitigate some of these tariff pressures. Maybe just to finish on your last question. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead with the last question.
Yeah, just to finish on the last question in terms of the risk of repurposing green policy as trade protection, how likely is this risk? How likely is this risk, and what would keep green policy from becoming a new form of trade barrier? I think this is a really great and important question. And I think here it really speaks to the necessity to reform the multilateral framework to have a consistent overarching policies that that economies can agree to. I think the carbon border adjustment that you mentioned is a really good example. When you have carbon tax, when you have certain economies that impose carbon tax, but others that do not, or when you have differing carbon tax, it is extremely costly for businesses and for trade. And so these are the areas that we can really identify as common goals that economies can cooperate on. Of course, balancing domestic constituencies while ensuring credible commitments to your trading partner is really important here. Sorry, back to you, Lee.
Excellent. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Ezequiel. It's been a great interaction. We are well past time, I'm afraid. So I will just take one question from the chat. This one is from Romario Hasugian from Indonesia. And he asks, how do you see ASEAN's role evolving in the future of the Asia-Pacific trade, especially amid competition between major powers such as the United States and China? And I picked that question in particular because ASEAN is getting more and more important for Chile. It's an area of special interest in terms of the country's international trade policy, and the country is actually negotiating right now with the Philippines and with Indonesia, a number of countries there. So it's an area of interest for Chile in particular, for the country's international trade policy. So if you can, Sharon, give us your thoughts on that, the ASEAN region and its role.
Sure, yeah. ASEAN, exactly. ASEAN is also increasingly important for economies like Canada, UK, for example. So ASEAN has a significant role in terms of what it can do, especially when it comes to competition between major powers as US and China. I think the collaboration here between Chile, ASEAN, Canada, ASEAN, especially in terms of regional trade agreements, accession to the TPP, accession to RCEP. I think these are all extremely useful tools to hold these major powers accountable, because it is also in their interest to uphold these rules and regulations that it has agreed on with the regional bloc. So I think ASEAN here has a significant role in terms of this kind of collaboration with economies like Chile, Peru, Canada, and so on.
Okay, and one more question. This one is from my own, actually. The report says that it's important to ensure regional and plurilateral agreements are integrated into the global system, right? So when it comes to major plurilateral agreements in the Asia Pacific, for example, the CPTPP, the RCEP, or CIP, the AP, I mean the Pacific Alliance, actually, even the DEPA, right, the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, the only one, 100% digital so far. Are you seeing that integration effort into the global system? Chile is right now a member of the CPTPP. It's applying to become a member of the RCEP, right? It's a member of and a founder member of the DEPA, right? So that's why I think this question is kind of relevant for us.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point, especially, for example, the digital agreement, as well as agreements like TPP, where it has, TPP for Canada is viewed as one of the gold standards. Whether that's true or not, we can really see from the actual effectiveness of the agreement. But what is interesting about TPP are kind of these newer areas in which the multilateral system is not able to address, whether that's labor related, or, as you mentioned, the digital agreement. So these agreements are much more advanced and more innovative in addressing some of the modern issues that we are facing today that the multilateral system is unable to address. And so this is the reason why we recommended to view these agreements as complements rather than competition to the multilateral system in terms of drawing experience and lessons from these existing policies that we've put in place. Now, the only challenge, as I mentioned, is the spaghetti bowl effect in terms of these overlapping rules and which rules or which policies are actually best to be integrated at the multilateral level. And so these are some of the continuous challenges that we have that warrants further discussion.
Okay, thank you so much, Sharon. Well, we ran our time, so I'll go straight away with Rodrigo's closing remarks. Rodrigo, thanks so much for all your support to make this a reality. And go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Luis Alberto. Well, there's not much to add to the excellent presentation of Sharon and the discussion by Ezequiel. I mean, it has been a wonderful discussion. I think they were both very clear in establish what are the challenges that we have ahead. I would like just to highlight some of them because they did a very good job at discussing them. So it's clear that we need to think about reforms for the future of the international trade. The problem with the reforms is, I mean, there are many problems, but I think there are two groups of problems. One is speed. There are some reforms that you can immediately implement. Some others will take time because you need negotiations and they may be very long time of negotiation. And they, of course, the speed depends on the other second important topic, which is the national interest. Countries are very different. They have different national interests, even among developed countries, not developed versus less developed countries. It's just developed countries has different interests, and of course, developing countries has different interests. So for the reforms, it's clear from the report that, and from Ezequiel discussion, that we need a multilateral system preservation reform. So the question is WTO the answer for this? Of course, if the answer is WTO, it needs urgently an update to the new trade climate and how to make it a more executive and influential WTO. I thought when I was younger that I will never see again the world using tariff and protectionism to use it for different other things like national security, resilience. So I say I will die, and free trade is here to stay forever, and so on. But so this is really a new world, and we need maybe a new WTO. Then one other answer that it was in the report is about the regional trade agreement and plurilateral agreements. And I think they're a good way to proceed, but not to isolate the regions. If a way to like a first step to go toward a more global agreement. And in that sense, I was thinking, what could align the interests of nations to participate in this kind of agreement and to build a new WTO where they've been respectful with the rules. I mean, if we create something, we have to be respectful of that. I mean, we create something and then we say, well, I don't like your decision, so I'm not following. So I thought green policy would be a way to align these interests. But as Ezequiel was saying, there is a huge incentive for free rider, right? So that I don't want to. It's expensive to implement green policy, so I will let somebody else do it, and I will go as a free rider. But it's an issue. Green policy is an important issue, and maybe it could generate some cooperation. And finally, I would like to say a few words about APEC as a cooperation. And as Sharon was saying, APEC should encourage open regionalism, which is pretty much agree with that. And APEC has been like an umbrella for building dialogue. But I think we need to go one step forward. We need to build dialogue, but more based on evidence. So there's countries introducing different policies. We should make an assessment of those policies and share those studies, those assessments, so every country can learn from each other. We need evidence before to decide what policy to follow. And I think it's a lot of political discussion, but little evidence on from the economic side if these policies are right or wrong, or what are the results of the policies. And the second thing for APEC, I think, is how they should think how to take this dialogue to action, to really action. It's a lot of dialogue, a lot of good intentions, but how you implement those things and how they make it real, not just stay in the political discussion. So how we go further, how we go to the last mile to really do something that is meaningful for our country. So I will end up saying thank you, Sharon, thank you, Ezequiel, for wonderful presentations. I think they were really, really good. And stay tuned for the new report, as Sharon was saying. The new report is about artificial intelligence and the effect on the economies. So it will come out sometimes by the end of this year. So thank you, Luis Alberto, for this opportunity to collaborate with Fundación Chilena del Pacífico.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Thank you for your support every step of the way. And I'm glad that you pointed out APEC's role going forward as to all, to tackle all the challenges that are ahead, which are immense in scope and in depth, as Sharon and Ezequiel made pretty clear during the event. So thank you so much to all of you, to all of to the members of our audience, and I'm sure this has been the first time that we do this around the SOTR and in partnership with the Catholic University of Chile and Sharon and the University of Calgary. And so hopefully we have another opportunity to carry out the same event next year around the next SOTR. Thank you so much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, thank you.